All right, so we've talked about what culture is and the aspects of culture, how we define culture. So now what I want to talk about is this feeling of stability within culture. So when we think about our culture or American culture, we tend to think it's very stable or static. It's not really changing. But that actually is a misconception. Cultural processes and culture itself changes quite frequently. If you look from generation to generation, it's a little easier to see that change, but it's always kind of changing. We just don't really realize it. And so we kind of need a stable society in order to function. Societies function most smoothly when cultural processes seem very natural and stable. If they're always feeling like they're changing, you never know what to expect within your culture, that can be kind of unsettling. So people need kind of this cultural stability. And enculturation, remember that process, it starts as soon as you're born, it continues through your entire life. And so every single day, enculturation is happening. Okay? And whether you know that or not, it's being taught to you how to behave in your culture. So enculturation is working every single day. And so that's partly why it doesn't feel like it's changing. If you were taught everything you needed to know when you were a baby, and then at 10 years old it changed, that would be very noticeable. But change is gradual over time, and you're constantly being retaught the norms, rules, values, and morals of your culture. Okay, so it doesn't feel like it's changing even though it is. And then our experience of culture is constantly being stabilized and reinforced through symbols, which we've already talked about, values, norms, and traditions. Okay, so these things help keep us in this kind of stable mindset when we think about our culture. So again, when we're talking about symbols in this context, it's something that's conventionally and arbitrarily it's going to stand for something else, okay? So these symbols do change, sometimes dramatically, sometimes very quickly, but for the most part, they're relatively stable. So the American flag, for example, is a symbol of American culture. It's a symbol of freedom, of self-determination, of independence, of prosperity, right? So we have this symbol, and it might change. Maybe now it means less of those things and maybe more inclusion or something like that. So these symbols do change. Okay, they're also very easily remembered. It's easy to remember the American flag and the feeling that it gives you, even if you don't always remember those values, norms, and morals of American culture. You can easily remember the symbol if it sparks that memory, that feeling for you of those values. Okay, and they help to preserve a culture's conventional meanings, and so conserve it across individuals. So if I see the American flag and everyone else sees the American flag every day, it kind of reinforces that symbol in our minds and in our culture. Our values, values, excuse me, are symbolic expressions of intrinsically desirable principles or qualities. So these are sometimes cultural, sometimes individual. So in American society, we think about independence. We value independence. That's one of our values. Okay, so independence is something that we perceive as desirable just for its own sake. Okay, it's desirable to be an independent person. And so these values are going to conserve your dominant ideas, or the society's dominant ideas about morality and social issues. And they change, but not quite as quickly. So it's hard to change American values. They do change, so you don't want to think about these things as being static, but at the same time, it changes a little more slowly. Okay. Norms, these are typical patterns of behavior. Okay. So these are unwritten rules of everyday life. We learn these very, very early. So burping in church, not appropriate. Okay, you know that. That even seems strange to think that someone might not know that, right? So we learn these at an early age in this process of enculturation. This lets us function in our society and avoid a lot of awkward situations. And so we don't really think about these norms until someone breaks one. Okay, you don't go to church and think like, oh, this is how I'm exactly supposed to behave. I don't walk down the street and think, okay, it is absolutely normal for me to not stare at that person. But then someone stares at you, and then you realize that norm. It becomes more clear to you. And then traditions are the most enduring and ritualized aspects of culture. Okay, Pledge of Allegiance, as you can see in the photo there, is an amazing example of an enduring, ritualized aspect of our culture. These are usually assumed to be timeless or very old. So they have this feeling of this is how things have always been and always will be, when in fact traditions are generally pretty recent if you think about the history of the U.S. So people get, let's stick with the pledge, people get upset about the insertion or when people remove under God from the pledge. So if you choose to say the Pledge of Allegiance and remove the phrase under God, people get upset about that and think, well, that is how the pledge has always been. Well, that was actually added in response to communism, so it's more recent than people like to think. And those aren't conscious decisions, right? But traditions feel very, very stable. So engaging in traditions allows us to feel very connected to our culture and makes it feel very stable. And then we have the question of, can anyone own culture? So now we know what culture is. We have this idea of culture. Can anyone own it? The answer is no, not really. So you can't own a process. Remember, culture is a process. It's not a thing. So you can't really own it. But you do we kind of get into arguments about the use of certain symbols. Okay, so that it gives the culture meaning. And so if you take that meaning out of the culture, it seems like you've taken something that belongs to those people, right? So it's the process of cultural appropriation that we're referring to here. And that's just the unilateral decision of one social group to take control over the symbols, practices, and objects of another. Okay, so this doesn't really happen, it happens in really kind of one specific way, I guess I'm trying to say. So it's partly a power dynamic. So it's nearly impossible for a culture with less political or social power to appropriate the dominant culture. You can't appropriate the dominant culture, then you're just blending into the dominant culture. But the dominant culture can appropriate a non-dominant culture. So you hear a lot about appropriation of black culture in the United States. And so this is when the dominant white culture is taking aspects of black culture and taking it and making it their own. And it does seem it does seem wrong to do that in some sense, right? So it seems like you're taking something that belongs to those people, when in fact no one can really own it. But you're kind of taking their cultural knowledge and using it outside of its cultural context, which strips it of its meaning. Another really good example is conflict over mascots. Okay, so if we're looking at college and professional sports teams, we see a lot of use of Native American imagery. Okay, so in what ways are Native American mascots celebrations of Indian culture or Native American culture, and in what ways do they take away from that culture? What ways are they being insensitive to that culture? So think about that kind of on your own time. It's likely going to be one of our discussion questions for this week, something I'd like you all to continue thinking about, and we can discuss further in the discussions. Okay, so we kind of just went over very basically what culture is. Remember, it's a process, it's dynamic, it makes artificial things around us seem natural. It's those things we have, think, and do. So our material possessions, our thought processes, and our behaviors. So keep reading your textbook. Be sure to continue reading on through and read about applied anthropology, because that's going to be the next topic we cover.